Can I sit here?
Did you know that the wealthiest woman in the entire Midwest once sat down, uninvited, at the poorest table in a run-down diner off Route 9? And that nobody in that diner knew she had spent 22 years looking for exactly that table. Hang on before you keep watching. If stories that squeeze your chest are your thing, hit like, and stay until the end, because what happened that night in a little town outside Dayton changed the name Whitfield forever. Let's get into it. It was 9:40 on a Tuesday night, and the cold coming off Lake Erie had turned mean somewhere around 6 o'clock. Ruthie's Diner sat on the corner of 5th and Larch, one of those places with a buzzing open sign missing its N, in a part of town that GPS apps routed around if they could help it. Inside, the air smelled like scorched coffee, fryer grease, and the particular kind of quiet that settles over a place late on a weeknight, when the only people left are the ones with nowhere better to be. Preston Vance walked 2 steps behind his boss, phone in one hand, jaw tight. He was the head of communications for the Voss Foundation, and he had not signed up for this. "Not here, Eleanor," he said, low enough that only she could hear. "This is not the plan." But Eleanor Voss had already stopped walking. She was standing in front of the poorest man in the building. On the old television bolted above the pie case, the local news was looping her face for the 3rd time that hour. Tech billionaire and philanthropist Eleanor Voss arrives tonight ahead of tomorrow's ribbon cutting for the new Voss Literacy Center. There she was on screen, in a rain-spotted camel coat, hair wind-whipped, eyes tired in a way no amount of money could quite cover up. In the last booth, under a fluorescent light that flickered every few seconds like it couldn't make up its mind, sat Marcus Whitfield and his 9-year-old daughter, Nora. They were splitting a single plate of chili fries, cut into careful, even portions so it would stretch. His jacket had gone thin at the elbows. Her mittens didn't match, one red, one blue, clearly borrowed from someone bigger. Between them sat 2 glasses of water and a small dish of ranch dressing rationed so thin it barely covered the bottom. Eleanor looked at the empty chair across from them. Then at Marcus. "Can I sit here?" she asked quietly. The whole diner seemed to hold its breath. Preston stepped closer, dropping his voice like kindness itself was a PR liability. "Eleanor. There's a private room in the back. Press is right outside. This isn't the image we planned for tonight." Marcus looked up slowly. He didn't see net worth. He didn't see the cameras, the foundations, or the name half the state said with a kind of reverence. He saw a woman standing alone with wet shoes, working very hard to keep her loneliness from showing. "It's just a chair," he said. Nora slid out of the booth immediately and pulled the seat back with both hands. "Sit here. My mom always said people shouldn't eat alone." Eleanor blinked. For 1 second, the woman who had spoken in front of senators, investors, and packed stadiums looked like a child had just pressed a thumb into an old bruise she thought she'd hidden well enough. She sat down slowly, like the torn vinyl of that booth mattered more than the velvet chairs waiting for her at the gala. Ruthie, who ran the counter, stopped wiping the same coffee ring she'd been working on for 10 minutes. A trucker near the door leaned back in his seat. 2 teenagers at the counter went quiet mid-sentence. Even the grill seemed to hush its sizzle, like something without a name had reached out and put a hand over the noise of the room. Marcus nudged the little dish of ranch a few inches closer to her. "We just ordered the 1 plate," he said, easy, no shame in it. "But it stretches fine if nobody minds eating a little slower." Preston let out a dry laugh. "Buddy, do you know who you're talking to?" Marcus took a breath and gave Nora the bigger half of the fries. "Someone who's hungry," he said. "That's usually enough for me." Eleanor looked at the plate, then back at the man across from her. His hands were rough from work, knuckles scarred in that way that comes from years of using them, but there was a steadiness in them that reminded her of a stack of letters she'd kept hidden for most of her life. Letters from a stranger who signed only with 2 letters, M.W. She had come to this town looking for the person who saved her when she was a forgotten 12-year-old with failing eyesight and no family who could pay for the surgery that fixed it. She had gone through records, church basements, old scholarship files, papers half-eaten by time. She'd followed the last thread to this diner without fully understanding why. Now, across from her, Marcus Whitfield was smiling at his daughter and splitting his own portion again so it would stretch a little further. Eleanor didn't know it yet, but the man everyone in that diner was quietly judging was the reason she could see the world clearly at all. She reached for the fork he offered, but before she could take the first bite, the bell over the door jingled and a gust of frozen air rolled in like an opinion nobody asked for. Marcus stood without any drama, walked to the door, and pushed it shut with his shoulder. Outside, an old man was struggling to zip his coat, boots sinking into slush at the curb. Marcus looked at him, then at the nearly empty tip jar by the register. He didn't sigh. He didn't make an announcement. He just pulled the last 20 from his pocket, folded it once, and pressed it into Ruthie's hand. "Soup for Mr. Delgado," he said quietly. "Put it on my tab." Ruthie looked at him with the tired kind of sadness people get watching someone give away money they need themselves. "Marcus, you already worked a double today." "Guess I had enough left over to share," he said, and went back to the booth. Nora watched from the booth, chin in both hands, proud and worried at the same time. Eleanor caught that look. It was the look of a child who knew her father was good, and also knew that goodness didn't always pay the electric bill. Marcus sat back down, shook the sleet off his sleeve, and picked up his fork like nothing had happened. Preston studied him, eyes narrowed. "You make a habit of feeding strangers?" "Only when they're hungry," Marcus answered. "That's not a financial plan," Preston said. Marcus almost smiled. "It's not supposed to be a financial plan. It's supposed to be a plan for being a person." The words sat there on the table with a strange weight to them. The fluorescent light flickered again, catching the fine lines near Marcus's eyes, an old burned scar on his wrist, and a wedding ring hanging from a thin chain under his collar, because some promises don't leave when the person does. He'd lived in that neighborhood long enough that people thought they knew him. They knew he drove a blue pickup with a rusted-out fender. They knew he rented a room above the laundromat on Campo Street. They knew he packed Nora's lunch in paper bags and walked her to school on the mornings the truck wouldn't start. What they didn't know was that every month, even the leanest ones, Marcus mailed an envelope to a scholarship office that had changed its name 3 times in 10 years. Some months it was $400. Some months it was $90. Once, after Nora came down with a bad flu and the electric bill spiked, he'd had nothing left but $31 in change and a note that read, "For someone who needs a tomorrow." He never signed his full name. Just M.W. Nora had asked him once why they helped kids they'd never meet. It had been late October, first frost silvering the laundromat windows, and Marcus had been counting coins on the kitchen table. "Because your mom believed a kid who gets helped at the right time can grow up and become somebody's miracle," he'd told her. Nora had thought about that seriously. Then she'd pushed 3 coins from her own piggy bank across the table toward him. Then, you too, she'd whispered. "Maybe somebody needs a little miracle right now." Across from Eleanor Voss, that same girl tore her napkin into the rough shape of a heart and set it beside Eleanor's coffee cup. Eleanor stared at the little paper shape like it was something expensive, something strange, something no board of shareholders had ever thought to give her. "Your daughter's very sweet," she said. Marcus glanced at Nora, and the exhaustion in his face softened into something close to grace. "Had a good teacher?" "Her mother?" Eleanor asked carefully. Marcus nodded once. "And life? Life teaches you plenty, if you let it make you soft instead of hard." Preston shifted, uncomfortable, thumb already moving over his phone screen, calculating the damage this strange little scene might do to Eleanor's image. But Eleanor wasn't listening to him anymore. She was watching Marcus lift his water glass and quietly slide the last bite of the fries toward Nora, like dignity wasn't something a man demanded, it was something he practiced when he believed no one important was watching. She held the little paper heart between her fingers, and for a moment the diner seemed to fall away at its fragile edges. The voices at the counter blurred. The wind pushed harder against the glass. Behind her, the television kept looping clips of her foundation, her speeches, her smile next to governors and schoolchildren. But tonight, the woman in that booth didn't feel like that woman at all. She felt 12 years old again, sitting under a cracked window in a church basement, pretending she could still read the chalkboard while the letters started to swim and disappear. Back then, her name didn't open any doors. Back then, Eleanor Voss had 2 sweaters, a pair of shoes with cardboard lining the soles, and a fear so big she carried it like a second backpack. "You okay?" Marcus asked gently. Eleanor looked up too fast. "Yes," she said. "Just thinking." Preston gave a polished little smile. "Eleanor thinks a lot. That's why half the state wants 5 minutes of her time." Marcus didn't take the bait. "Must get lonely," he said. Preston laughed under his breath. "Lonely? She owns buildings in 6 states. Nora tilted her head. "Buildings don't talk to you when you're sad." Eleanor looked at the girl, and the truth of that simple sentence hit harder than any compliment she'd heard all year. She set the paper heart down beside her cup and wrapped both hands around the warm mug, not because she was cold anymore, but because she needed something solid to hold on to. The real reason she'd come to this town wasn't the gala, or the cameras, or the ribbon she'd cut in the morning. Those were useful reasons, reasons Preston could put on a schedule and explain to reporters. The real reason was hidden in a leather folder in her hotel room, tucked under contracts and donor lists. 8 letters. 9 old receipts. A black and white photograph clipped from a small-town newspaper 22 years old, a girl in thick glasses standing outside St. Anne's Children's Home, smiling shyly next to a nurse after an eye surgery no one expected her to be able to afford. At the bottom of the first receipt, 2 letters written in blue ink, M.W. No last name. No address that still existed. Just monthly payments, sometimes small, sometimes strangely exact, like whoever sent them gave whatever was left over after groceries, rent, and everything life took first. The letters came with the money. They weren't long, and they weren't sentimental, just enough words that a scared kid wouldn't give up. "You're not alone. Keep reading. The world's going to need what you see." Eleanor had built an ed tech empire, but before the investors, before the awards, before she became the kind of woman people stood up for when she walked into a room, she'd had those letters. They had carried her through foster placements, through college, through overnight shifts, through the first company she'd started in a rented room with bad heating and borrowed folding chairs. She had quietly hired researchers, dug through parish records, traced the old scholarship fund through a fire, a merger, a dead storage warehouse, and finally to a handwritten ledger that mentioned this town. Now she was sitting in the last booth of a small diner, watching a tired single father wipe a smear of ranch dressing off his daughter's sleeve with the corner of a napkin. His name was Marcus Whitfield. M.W. The initials brushed against her mind like a match too close to paper, but she pushed the thought away because it felt too impossible, too humble, too close. The man she'd always pictured was older, better off, maybe a retired doctor or a quiet lawyer with money to spare, not this man with worn-out elbows and kind eyes, making his own dinner smaller so everyone else's would stretch. "So what brought you to town?" Marcus asked. Eleanor opened her mouth, and for the first time in years, the rehearsed answer didn't come. She looked at Nora's paper heart, then at the storm behind the window. "I'm looking for someone," she said quietly. Marcus nodded. "Someone lost?" Her voice went softer. "No. Someone who found me first." The words hung between them like a candle neither of them wanted to blow out. Marcus watched her with a stillness that didn't push. He'd learned a long time ago that people carry locked rooms inside them, and love doesn't kick that door down. Love waits on the porch with a warm plate of food until the person's ready. Then I hope you find them, he said. Eleanor studied his face, looking for a flicker of recognition, some hint of guilt or pride, but there was only quiet kindness. Preston slid his phone into his jacket pocket and leaned forward. Eleanor, the mayor's already at the venue. Press has been waiting 20 minutes. We can't build a national literacy campaign around you eating chili fries with strangers. Nora frowned at him. We're not strangers anymore. Preston gave her the kind of smile adults use when they want a child to feel small. That's sweet, sweetheart. But Ms. Voss has responsibilities. Marcus's eyes came up, calm but firmer now. At this table, her name's Eleanor. For the first time all night, Preston didn't have a quick answer. The old clock above the counter kept ticking too loudly. Outside, freezing rain slid down the glass in sheets. Ruthie poured coffee for a man who'd already paid and then quietly filled a second cup for the one who hadn't paid anything at all. Eleanor felt the careful architecture of her public life loosen, not collapse, just loosen. Titles had always protected her. Schedules had armored her. Money had built her rooms nobody could get too close to. And yet here, in a booth with torn vinyl and a slightly crooked napkin dispenser, a little girl had called her by her first name, and a tired father had defended that name without expecting anything back. Do you draw a lot? Eleanor asked Nora, nodding at the notebook by her plate. Nora's whole face lit up. Every day. My dad says drawing is how quiet people talk. It says a lot without needing to. You should hear yourself sometimes, Marcus said, a small smile tugging at his mouth. Dad, that wasn't a complaint. Nora opened the notebook carefully, flipping through pages, snowmen, school buses, a brown dog with wings, her mother drawn as a star floating above an apartment building. Then she stopped on a page Eleanor wasn't ready for. It showed a huge ballroom full of people in fancy clothes. Every chair was filled except one. At the edge of the room stood a woman in a long coat, her face turned away, hands clasped in front of her like she'd forgotten how to ask for something. Above it, in a kid's crooked handwriting, it said, "The lady with no table." Eleanor's fingers tightened around her mug. Why'd you draw her? She asked, almost a whisper. Nora shrugged, suddenly shy. I saw you on TV last week. Everybody was clapping, but you looked like nobody was sitting with you. Preston shifted uncomfortably. That's a very imaginative interpretation. Marcus didn't look at him. He looked at Eleanor. Kids notice what grown-ups edit out. The sentence landed so gently it hurt. Eleanor had spent years being admired in rooms full of people, and yet no one had ever noticed the empty seat beside her. Not the investors. Not the politicians. Not the reporters who praised her vision. But a little girl in a diner booth had seen it through a television screen. For a moment, Eleanor couldn't speak. She turned back a page and found another drawing, smaller and unfinished. A man holding an umbrella over two kids, letting the rain soak his own shoulders. Nora had written underneath, Dad helping again. Have you always been like that? Eleanor asked him. Nora answered proudly instead. He says even when your hands are full, you can always make room in your heart for somebody. Marcus cleared his throat, a little embarrassed. Nora, people don't need my whole philosophy with dessert. It's true, though, Nora said. Truth still needs manners, he said. Eleanor laughed then, not the rehearsed laugh she used for donors, but something surprised and human, the kind that breaks tension the way sunlight breaks through a dusty window. Even Marcus smiled. Even Ruthie turned away with wet eyes. Preston, though, looked toward the front window, where two local photographers had gathered under the awning, cameras already pointed at the booth. His face hardened, and Eleanor noticed it, the calculation, the fear of an image that wasn't in the script, the belief that a poor man's table could stain a billionaire's brand. But Eleanor wasn't afraid of being seen there anymore. She looked at Nora's drawing again, the lady with no table, and pulled it slowly toward her chest. "Can I keep this?" she asked. Nora glanced at Marcus for permission, and he nodded. "Only if you promise to sit at a table next time," Nora said. Eleanor looked at Marcus, then around the rest of the diner, where the quiet had turned into something closer to attention. "I think," she said, "I already did." Preston watched the photographers raise their cameras, and something in him shifted, not suddenly, not obviously, but the way a man moves when he believes every human moment needs to be managed before it becomes a headline. He stood beside the booth and put a light hand on the back of Eleanor's chair. "Okay," he said, still smiling for the cameras. "That was a lovely little moment, but we're done here." Eleanor looked up at him. "I decide when I'm done." "No," Preston said, lowering his voice. "The foundation decides. The board decides. The donors waiting at the hotel decide. You're the face of a national campaign, not a woman collecting sad stories in the middle of a storm." The diner shifted at that. A spoon clinked against a plate somewhere. Someone at the counter muttered under their breath. Marcus folded his napkin calmly and set it beside his empty plate. "You can talk to me however you want," he said. "But you don't get to talk over her." Preston turned to face him fully, his politeness curdling into contempt. "And who exactly are you?" Nora tensed. "I'm her dad," Marcus said, nodding toward Nora. "That's the only title I need tonight." Preston let out a laugh a little too sharp. "A noble single dad, a worn-out jacket, a sweet kid with her little drawings. Forgive me if I've seen this before. It plays great on camera and terribly on a balance sheet." The room went colder than the weather outside. Eleanor set her cup down slowly. "Preston." "I'm doing my job," he said. "Your job is advising me," Eleanor said, and her voice, for the first time that night, had the edge people recognized from boardrooms. "Not deciding who's allowed to sit across from me." Preston opened his mouth, then closed it. He glanced at the photographers outside, at Ruthie watching from behind the counter, at the trucker who had stopped pretending not to listen. He straightened his jacket like the fabric could restore some authority the room had already stripped from him. "Fine," he said. "Have your moment. But when this ends up on some blog by morning, I want it on record that I advised against it." "Noted," Eleanor said quietly, and turned back to Marcus like Preston had already left the building, even though he hadn't. Marcus exhaled and rubbed the back of his neck, the fight draining out of him now that it was over. "Sorry," he said to Eleanor. "Didn't mean to cause you trouble with your people." "You didn't cause anything," Eleanor said. "You just told the truth in front of people who aren't used to hearing it." Nora, watching the whole exchange with wide eyes, finally spoke again, quieter this time. "Are you gonna get in trouble because of us?" "No," Eleanor said, and meant it. "If anything, I think I've been in trouble for a long time, and tonight might be the first time somebody helped me out of it." She looked back down at the folded drawing in her hands, then up at Marcus. There was something she needed to say, and it had waited 22 years to be said in the right room. She just didn't know yet if this was the right room, or if her voice would hold. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "And it might sound strange." Marcus tilted his head. "Strange questions are usually the honest kind." "Did you ever send money to a scholarship fund?" Eleanor asked. "A long time ago. Small amounts. Some months bigger than others. Signed with just your initials." The diner seemed to lean in without moving. Ruthie stopped wiping the counter entirely. Even Preston, halfway to the door, paused. Marcus went still. The color didn't leave his face so much as settle differently, the way a man's expression changes when a door he thought was closed for good creaks open again. "That was a long time ago," he said slowly. "Before Nora." "Before," he stopped, glanced at the wedding ring hanging beneath his shirt, and started again. My wife and I did that for a few years. After we lost our own baby before Nora came along. We didn't have much. But we had a little, and we figured a little given at the right time could matter more than a lot given too late. Eleanor's hands were shaking now, and she didn't try to hide it. Do you remember a scholarship office that changed its name a few times? Handwritten receipts? A photograph of a girl outside a children's home after eye surgery? Marcus's jaw tightened. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Nora reached over and put her small hand on top of his. There was a girl, he said finally, voice rough. 12 years old, I think. Something wrong with her eyes. The home couldn't cover the surgery, and the fund we usually sent to was short that quarter. My wife said we'd find the difference somewhere. We sold the truck's spare parts we didn't need. Picked up extra shifts. Mailed what we had with a note, because that's all we ever really had to give, money and a few words. You're not alone, Eleanor said quietly, the words rising out of her like they'd been sitting in her throat for 2 decades. Keep reading. The world's going to need what you see. Marcus looked at her like the floor had shifted under the booth. How do you know that? Eleanor reached into her coat and pulled out a small leather notebook she'd carried in her inside pocket for years, the way some people carry a photograph of someone they've lost. She opened it to a folded page and slid it across the table. It was a photocopy of an old letter, the ink faded but the handwriting unmistakable once you knew to look, a slight left-leaning slant, the way the letter W was written with a small hook at the end, the same hook Marcus had just used signing the diner receipt for Ruthie without even thinking about it. Marcus stared at the photocopy for a long time without touching it, like it might disappear if he moved too fast. I kept every letter you sent, Eleanor said. For 22 years. I didn't know your name. I didn't know your face. I just knew 2 letters, MW. And I built my entire life trying to become someone who deserved what those letters gave me. Marcus's eyes were wet now, and he wasn't trying to hide it either. I never thought, his voice cracked. We never knew what happened to any of the kids. We just hoped. My wife used to say hope doesn't need proof to keep working. She was right, Eleanor said. I'm proof. I just took 22 years to walk back into the room and say it. Nora looked between the 2 adults, piecing it together slower than the grown-ups but getting there. Wait, she said. You're the miracle. The one Mom said might happen someday? Eleanor laughed, and this time it broke a little in the middle, turning into something closer to tears. I think I might be, she said. I think your dad and your mom gave a scared kid with bad eyes and no family a reason to keep going, back when nobody else would. Marcus put his hand over his mouth for a second, steadying himself the way men do when the 2 options are crying in a diner or not crying in a diner, and he was choosing, badly, the second one. You built all this, he said finally, gesturing vaguely at the world outside the window, the cameras, the foundation, the years of headlines. Because of $40 in loose change and a couple sentences from 2 people who could barely keep their own lights on. Because of everything you couldn't afford but gave anyway, Eleanor said. I've sat across from senators and CEOs asking me to explain my success, and none of them ever got the real answer, because the real answer was you. It was always going to be you. I just didn't know your face until tonight. Ruthie set down the coffee pot she'd been holding this whole time without pouring anything, and quietly wiped at her own eyes with the corner of her apron. The trucker near the door had turned fully around in his seat. Even the 2 teenagers at the counter had stopped scrolling their phones. Preston stood by the door, phone forgotten in his hand, watching the scene he tried to shut down 20 minutes earlier turn into something no press release could have staged, because nobody would have dared write it this way. It was too quiet, too plain, too much like real life instead of a headline. Eleanor reached across the table and, for the first time all night, took Marcus's rough, work-scarred hand in both of hers. I didn't come to this town for the ribbon cutting, she said. I came because a records clerk in a dead storage warehouse found a ledger with your name half legible in it, and I couldn't leave until I found you. I just didn't expect to find you sharing chili fries with your daughter in the last booth of a diner, giving away your last $20 to a stranger in the cold. Old habit, Marcus said, wiping his face with the back of his sleeve. Guess some things don't change, even after the money runs out. They shouldn't, Eleanor said. That's the part one came to thank you for. Not the money. The habit. Nora, who had been quiet for once, tugged gently on her father's sleeve. Dad. Does this mean we're not alone anymore either? Marcus looked at his daughter, then at Eleanor, then at the paper heart still resting near Eleanor's cup, a little crumpled now from being held so tightly. I don't think we ever really were, he said. But it's good to be reminded. Eleanor sat back slightly, wiping her own eyes with the sleeve of a coat that cost more than most of the cars parked outside, and for once didn't care how that looked. I want to do something, she said. Not charity. Not a headline. I want to set up something real, for kids like the one I used to be, and for parents like you, who give until there's nothing left because they believe it matters. I want your name on it. Not mine. Marcus shook his head slowly. I don't need my name on anything. I know, Eleanor said. That's exactly why it should be there. Preston finally stepped forward again, and this time his voice had lost its polish entirely. Eleanor, he said quietly. I owe you an apology. I was trying to protect an image. I didn't understand what this actually was. Eleanor looked at him, not unkindly. Then let this be the new image, Preston. A billionaire who sat down at the poorest table in town and found out it was the only seat that ever mattered. Outside, the photographers were still snapping pictures through the window, but nobody in the booth was performing for them anymore. The story had already happened. The cameras were just late to it. Ruthie, brought over a fresh plate of chili fries without being asked, set it down in the middle of the table, and said, voice thick, this one's on the house. Both of you have given this town more than you know. Marcus tried to argue, out of habit, and Ruthie just shook her head and walked away before he could finish the sentence. Nora picked up her fork, looked between the two adults, and, with the simple clarity only a 9-year-old can manage after a night like that, said, Can we eat now? I think everybody needs to eat something after all that crying. Eleanor laughed again, wet-eyed and unguarded, and picked up her own fork. Yeah, she said. I think we do. Outside, the freezing rain kept falling against the glass, but inside that last booth, under a flickering yellow light, 22 years of searching finally had a table to sit at. Not a private room. Not a gala. A chipped vinyl booth in a diner that most people drove past without a second look. Because sometimes the person who saves you doesn't come back wearing a cape or a title. Sometimes they come back years later, tired and quiet, splitting one plate of fries 3 ways, giving away their last $20 to a stranger in the cold, still being exactly the kind of person worth finding. And sometimes all it takes to change everything is one simple question, asked by someone brave enough to sit down first. Can I sit with you? It turned out to be the most important 4 words either of them would ever say.